The winter of 1943 settled over the rolling farmlands of rural England with a peculiar weight. In a stone barn outside the village of Oakley, Buckinghamshire, 52-year-old Thomas Wickham stood before a jury-rigged copper still, watching clear liquid drip into glass containers with the precision of a chemist. The air hung thick with the sweet, sharp smell of fermenting grain, a scent that, under wartime regulations, could mean prison. But Wickham wasn't making whiskey for profit or pleasure. The high-proof alcohol trickling through his apparatus would, within 48 hours, fuel clandestine radio operations across occupied France, power the detonators for resistance sabotage missions, and provide the critical solvent for invisible inks used in messages that would save Allied lives. For 2 years, this farmer's illegal operation would produce over 12,000 litres of industrial-grade ethanol, becoming an unacknowledged link in the chain of Britain's Special Operations Executive, all while evading both local constables and Ministry of Food inspectors who could shut him down at any moment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how an ordinary English farmer became an essential supplier to Britain's shadow war, you must first understand the bureaucratic stranglehold that wartime rationing had placed on even the most critical military operations. By 1942, every ounce of grain, every drop of fuel, and every chemical compound in Britain existed within a labyrinth of permits, quotas, and official channels. The Ministry of Food, established in 1939 to manage the nation's dwindling resources, had implemented the most comprehensive rationing system in British history. Butter, meat, sugar, tea, these were the public face of deprivation. But behind closed doors, military planners faced an equally dire shortage that threatened to cripple Britain's most innovative warfare programs: industrial alcohol. The Special Operations Executive, Churchill's organisation for setting Europe ablaze through sabotage and subversion, required enormous quantities of high-purity ethanol. This wasn't the diluted spirits found in pubs, but 95% pure alcohol with exacting specifications. Radio operators in occupied territories needed it to fuel lightweight portable generators when electricity wasn't available. Resistance cells used it as a base for incendiary devices. The cryptography section required it for producing invisible inks. Field medics diluted it for antiseptic. Laboratories used it as a solvent for developing photographic intelligence. A single agent's mission kit might require 2 litres of specialised alcohol products, and by 1943, SOE was deploying hundreds of agents annually. The official supply chain had collapsed under its own complexity. Industrial distilleries were already operating at capacity, producing alcohol for munitions, manufacturing, medical supplies, and aviation fuel additives. To obtain ethanol, SOE had to submit requests through the Ministry of Supply, which coordinated with the Ministry of Food, which allocated grain through regional distribution boards, which then permitted distillation under strict supervision. The process took weeks, sometimes months. In a world where agents needed equipment for missions launching within days, the bureaucracy had become more dangerous than the Gestapo. Thomas Wickham had never intended to become a criminal. He had farmed the same 200 acres his grandfather had worked, growing wheat and barley in the heavy clay soil of Buckinghamshire. His farm sat 3 miles from Station 61, a requisitioned manor house that served as one of SOE's training facilities. Wickham had first encountered SOE in the autumn of 1942, when a polite major from the ministry had asked to rent his northern pasture for training exercises. The major paid triple the going rate and asked no questions when Wickham's livestock occasionally panicked from the pracases, sound of explosions echoing across the fields after midnight. The request that would change Wickham's life came on a February evening in 1943. The same major, whose name Wickham never learned, appeared at his kitchen door with unusual urgency. The major explained, with careful vagueness, that certain technical operations required regular supplies of high-purity alcohol that official channels couldn't provide quickly enough. He had noticed that Wickham grew barley and wheat. He wondered if Wickham had any experience with distillation. Wickham's grandfather had operated a small distillery before the Great War, producing farm whiskey for local consumption, a practice that had been common in rural England before tighter regulations. The old copper still remained in pieces in the barn's loft, a relic Wickham had never bothered to dismantle. He told the Major this. The Major nodded slowly, then asked a question that contained within it an entire moral proposition. Would you consider helping your country in a way that might not be entirely official? The Major was frank about the risks. Operating an unlicensed distillery violated the Finance Act of 1940, the Ministry of Food Regulations, and at least 3 wartime emergency orders. If discovered by civil authorities, Wickham could face substantial fines, imprisonment, and the confiscation of his farm. The mayor couldn't offer legal protection. SOE operated in the shadows. Acknowledging their connection to an illegal distillery would compromise security. If Wickham were arrested, he would stand alone. The Major could only offer generous payment, and the knowledge that his work would directly support operations against Nazi Germany. Wickham asked for 24 hours to consider. He spent that evening walking his fields, weighing his lifetime of law-abiding farming against the Major's request. His eldest son was serving with the 8th Army in North Africa. His nephew had died at Dunkirk. The war had already taken so much from his family. But what the Major proposed wasn't fighting, it was breaking his own country's laws. Yet those laws, Wickham understood, had been written for different times. They were meant to prevent profiteering and ensure fair distribution, noble goals that had somehow created a system where bureaucracy impeded the very military operations meant to win the war. He agreed the next morning. The Major returned 3 days later with a young chemist named Peter Ashford, a thin man of about 30 who had worked at a pharmaceutical company before the war. Ashford would serve as Wickham's technical advisor, teaching him to produce ethanol that met military specifications. They spent a week in Wickham's barn, rebuilding the old still, with components Ashford had requisitioned through channels Wickham didn't question. They added a fractionating column to improve purity, installed thermometers at critical points, and set up a small laboratory corner with hydrometers and test equipment. Ashford explained the chemistry with patient precision. Fermentation would convert the grain's starches into alcohol, but only to about 10 to 15% by volume. Distillation would concentrate this into the 90 to 95% purity SOE required. The process demanded careful temperature control. Ethanol boiled at 173 degrees Fahrenheit, while water boiled at 212. The narrow window between these temperatures was where purity was achieved. Too hot, and water vapor would contaminate the product. Too cool, and yield would plummet. They would use Wickham's barley, which he was officially growing under an agricultural production order. This was the delicate legal fiction that made the operation possible. Wickham was required to deliver a certain quota of grain to the Ministry of Food's collection depot. But harvests varied, quality fluctuated, and a certain percentage of loss to pests, spoilage, and damage was expected. If Wickham reported yields slightly below his field's potential, if he claimed spoilage in one of his storage barns, if he carefully siphoned off just enough grain to avoid triggering an investigation, he could accumulate sufficient raw material without detection. Ashford stressed the importance of discretion. The still could only operate at night, when the plume of steam from the condenser would be less visible. Smoke from heating still had to be minimized, which meant they would use anthracite coal that burned hot and relatively clean. The spent mash, the leftover grain pulp after fermentation, had to be disposed of carefully, either ploughed into fields as fertilizer or fed to livestock in amounts that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Empty, fermentation vats had to remain hidden. The finished product would be stored in sealed containers in a concealed cellar Wickham would construct beneath his barn's floor. The first batch began in March of 1943. Wickham started conservatively, diverting only 30 pounds of barley from his official quota. He soaked the grain for 2 days, allowing it to sprout slightly, a process called malting that would make the starches more accessible to yeast. Then he dried and crushed the malted barley, mixed it with warm water, and let the natural enzymes convert the starches to sugars. After adding yeast, he sealed the mixture in a 50-gallon oak barrel and waited. Fermentation took 10 days. Wickham checked the temperature twice daily, ensuring it stayed between 60 and 75 degrees. Too cold, and the yeast would go dormant. Too warm, and it would produce off flavors and reduce alcohol yield. He watched as the mixture bubbled and foamed, the yeast consuming sugar and exhaling carbon dioxide and alcohol. The smell was unmistakable, sweet, yeasty, and mildly alcoholic. Wickham hung dried lavender and herbs around the barn to mask the scent, claiming to neighbors that he was experimenting with herbal remedies for his livestock. The distillation began on a moonless night, with Ashford present to supervise. They heated the fermented mash slowly, watching the thermometers with absolute attention. At 173 degrees, vapor began rising through the fractionating column. This first vapor was rich in ethanol, which boiled at a lower temperature than water. As it rose through the column, it condensed and re-vaporized multiple times, each cycle increasing purity. Finally, clear liquid began dripping from the condenser coil into their collection flask. Ashford tested each fraction with a hydrometer, a glass instrument that measured specific gravity and, thereby, alcohol content. The first output, called heads, contained methanol and other volatile compounds that were toxic. Ashford discarded this. The next fraction, the hearts, was what they wanted, pure ethanol, clear as water, and measuring 93% alcohol by volume. They collected every drop in glass carboys. Finally, as the temperature crept higher, the tails began flowing lower-proof alcohol mixed with heavier compounds. Ashford separated this as well. It could be redistilled in the next batch to extract more ethanol. From 30 pounds of barley, after fermentation and distillation, they produced approximately 2 gallons of 93% ethanol. Ashford pronounced it acceptable, though not perfect. The purity could be improved with better temperature control and additional fractionation. But for a first attempt using rebuilt equipment, it met specifications. The mayor collected the 2 gallons 3 days later, leaving Wickham an envelope containing £20, nearly 3 months' wages for a farm labourer. It was more money than Wickham had ever made from 2 gallons of any product. The major said simply, "We'll need more, as much as you can produce." Over the following months, Wickham refined his illegal craft into a precise operation. He expanded from 1 fermentation barrel to 6, staggering their start dates so that a new batch was ready for distillation every 5 days. He excavated a hidden cellar beneath his barn floor, accessible through a concealed trapdoor beneath a pile of empty feed sacks, where he could store finished product away from prying eyes. He cultivated a reputation among neighbours as increasingly eccentric, a man who kept odd hours and muttered about crop rotation and soil chemistry, a useful cover for his nocturnal activities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The grain supply remained Wickham's most persistent anxiety. He walked a tightrope between production, demands and detection. His official harvest reports had to reflect realistic yields too low, and the local agricultural committee would investigate why his productive farm was underperforming. He couldn't simply hide grain. Inspectors occasionally spot-checked storage facilities. Instead, Wickham became a master of marginal deception. He reported moisture damage in one storage barn, requiring him to use that grain for livestock feed rather than human consumption. He claimed that rats had contaminated 2 tons of stored wheat, making it unsuitable for the Ministry of Food but acceptable for farm use. He carefully documented higher than actual livestock feed consumption, creating a paper trail that justified his grain usage. The system worked because it was plausible. Farms did experience losses. Animals did consume feed, and most importantly, Wickham was producing enough legitimate crops, delivered punctually to collection depots, that he remained in good standing with agricultural authorities. He was neither the best nor worst farmer in his district, precisely the position that attracted minimal attention. By summer of 1943, Wickham was producing approximately 50 gallons of high-purity ethanol monthly. The Major's collections became routine, arriving every 2 weeks with empty containers and leaving with filled ones. The payments continued, enough that Wickham was able to repair his tractor, replace his aging plough, and maintain his farm's legitimate operations without financial strain. But the money was never Wickham's primary motivation. His son's letters from North Africa reminded him weekly why this work mattered. The operation expanded in complexity when Ashford returned in July with a new request. SOE needed not just ethanol, but specialized alcohols with specific properties. Some operations required denatured alcohol, ethanol, rendered undrinkable by additives for use in portable stoves and fuel applications. Others needed isopropyl, alcohol for cleaning precision equipment. Could Wickham's operation accommodate these variations? Ashford brought additional equipment and chemicals. They set up a second, smaller still for experimental batches. Wickham learned to produce methanol from wood, a dangerous process involving steam treatment of hardwood chips that yielded a highly toxic alcohol, useful as a solvent. He learned to create alcohol-based gels by mixing ethanol with calcium acetate, producing a jelly-like substance that could be transported more safely than liquid and used for various tactical purposes. The risks escalated proportionally with the operation's sophistication. More equipment meant more to conceal. More chemical precursors meant more suspicious deliveries to explain. The barn became a complex web of hidden compartments, false walls, and carefully arranged debris that concealed fermentation vats, distillation apparatus, and chemical supplies. Wickham installed an alarm system, a simple arrangement, of strings and bells that would alert him if anyone approached the barn unexpectedly. He had 2 close calls in the autumn of 1943. The first came when a Ministry of Food inspector made an unannounced visit to verify Wickham's grain storage. Wickham received 5 minutes' warning from a neighbour who had spotted the inspector's vehicle on the road. He managed to lock the barn's inner sections and guide the inspector only through the legitimate storage areas, explaining that parts of the barn were unstable and unsafe. The inspector noted his cooperation and departed satisfied. The second incident was more serious. In October, a local constable investigating reports of unusual nighttime activity in the area stopped by to ask questions. Someone had reported seeing lights in Wickham's barn at odd hours and smelling strange odours. Wickham, keeping his voice steady, explained that he had been treating a sick cow that required round-the-clock attention, and that he had been applying various traditional remedies that did indeed smell unusual. He invited the constable to inspect the barn, gambling that the man wouldn't notice the concealed sections. The constable, a farmer's son himself, accepted the explanation and advised Wickham to inform neighbours before conducting late-night veterinary work to avoid future concerns. Both incidents rattled Wickham, but they also revealed the operation's fundamental protection: plausibility. His cover story as an eccentric farmer experimenting with livestock remedies and unusual agricultural techniques was believable precisely because it was partially true. He did treat his own animals. He did experiments with crop rotations. The fiction required only a slight exaggeration of the truth. By the end of 1943, Wickham had produced approximately 400 gallons of various alcohols. The Major, during one collection, mentioned in his typically vague way that Wickham's work had supported dozens of operations and that there had been very positive outcomes. He never specified what those operations were, and Wickham never asked. Operational security demanded ignorance. But Wickham sometimes imagined the trajectory of his product from his still to the Major's vehicle, to SOE's supply depot, to an agent's mission kit, to some barn in France or Norway or Poland, where men and women fought in the darkness. The winter of 1943 to 1944 brought new challenges. Fuel shortages made heating the still more difficult. Wickham had to carefully hoard coal, purchasing small amounts from multiple suppliers to avoid suspicion. Cold temperatures slowed fermentation, requiring him to insulate his fermentation vats with straw and burlap. Ice threatened his water supply, essential for condensing alcohol vapor, yet production couldn't cease. The Major emphasized that winter was when SOE's need was greatest. Operations in occupied territories intensified during the long nights and agent deployments increased. Wickham adapted. He built an insulated shed within the barn, creating a temperature-controlled environment for fermentation. He discovered that maintaining consistent warmth required less fuel than periodically reheating cold mash. He learned to time distillation runs for the coldest nights, when condenser efficiency peaked and the cold air more effectively concealed any telltale steam. The spring of 1944 brought an unmistakable shift in atmosphere. The Major's visits increased in frequency, and the quantities requested doubled. Wickham was now producing nearly 100 gallons monthly, operating the still almost every night. Ashford appeared more frequently, sometimes staying for days to supervise experimental batches with demanding specifications. Neither man explained the urgency, but Wickham understood. Something significant was approaching. In May, the mayor made an unusual request. Could Wickham accommodate a surge in production over the next 6 weeks? SOE needed a substantial reserve of ethanol for an upcoming operation. He couldn't say more, but the need was critical. Wickham would need to produce an additional 200 gallons beyond his normal output. The Major acknowledged this was asking for significant risk. The increased grain diversion, the extended distillation runs, the greater volume of product stored on the premises all magnified the danger of discovery. Wickham agreed without hesitation. He diverted his entire month's seed grain allocation, a risky decision that would complicate his planting schedule. He ran still continuously, catching brief sleep between batches. His farm's legitimate work suffered. Fields went unweeded, fences unrepaired. Neighbours commented on his haggard appearance. Wickham claimed illness, a plausible excuse that also explained why he spent so much time indoors. The production surge succeeded. By early June, Wickham had accumulated 300 gallons of ethanol stored in sealed containers in his concealed cellar. The Major collected it in 3 separate trips, his vehicle laden with crates marked as agricultural supplies. On the final collection, on June 3rd, the Major gripped Wickham's hand with unusual intensity. "What you've done will matter more than you can know," he said. "In a few days, you'll understand why." On June 6, 1944, Wickham listened to his wireless as the BBC announced the Allied invasion of Normandy. Thousands of paratroopers had dropped behind German lines in the pre-dawn hours. Glider forces had seized critical bridges. Commandos had stormed fortified beaches. As he absorbed the scale of Operation Overlord, Wickham understood where his alcohol had gone. Radio operators coordinating the airborne assault would be using generators fueled by his ethanol. Resistance cells activated to sabotage German communications were using explosives detonated by alcohol-based primers. Intelligence officers were processing captured documents with his solvents. Field medics were treating the wounded with his antiseptic. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. His illegal distillery, his months of careful deception and anxious nights, had been a minuscule component in history's largest amphibious invasion. Yet that component had been necessary. Without the steady supply of specialized alcohols flowing through covert channels, some radio wouldn't have transmitted, some explosives wouldn't have detonated, and some messages wouldn't have been decoded. Lives had depended on his ability to produce clean ethanol from smuggled grain in a hidden barn in Buckinghamshire. The weeks following D-Day saw no reduction in demand. If anything, the Major's requirements intensified. The expanding Allied foothold in France required a massive increase in SOE operations supply drops to resistance forces, intelligence gathering behind fluid front lines, sabotage of German reinforcement routes. Each operation consumed resources, including the specialized alcohols Wickham produced. But the sustained production pace was unsustainable. By July, Wickham was physically exhausted and running critically short of grain. His spring planting had been compromised by the June surge, and his harvest would suffer. He couldn't maintain current production levels without catastrophic grain shortages that would inevitably trigger investigation. When Ashford visited in mid-July, Wickham explained the situation, bluntly. He could continue at reduced output, perhaps 50 gallons monthly, or he could maintain current production for another month before the entire operation collapsed. Ashford consulted with the Major, returning 2 days later with new instructions. They would reduce to 50 gallons monthly through the autumn, allowing Wickham to stabilize his grain supplies and reduce detection risk. SOE was establishing additional supply sources. The successful invasion had freed resources, created new procurement channels. Wickham's operation, while still valuable, was no longer the critical bottleneck it had been. The reduction brought relief but also a strange sense of loss. Wickham had grown accustomed to the relentless pace, the constant tension, the knowledge that his work directly fed the war effort. Scaling back felt like stepping away from the front lines, even though he had never left his farm. The autumn of 1944 brought its own anxieties. The Allied advance had stalled after the initial breakthrough. Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation in the Netherlands, had failed with heavy losses. German resistance was stiffening. The war that many had hoped would end by Christmas clearly would not, and Wickham's operation, now in its 20th month, faced mounting risks from simple probability. The longer the distillery operated, the greater the chance of discovery. Every additional month was another opportunity for a careless mistake, an unexpected inspection, or simply bad luck. In November, Wickham experienced his most dangerous close call. A fire inspector, conducting routine surveys of farm buildings for fire safety compliance, arrived unannounced. Wickham was in the barn, actively distilling, when he heard the inspector's vehicle. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the man reached the barn door. He shut down the still's heating element, but couldn't stop the distillation already in progress. Vapour continued flowing through the apparatus, alcohol dripped into collection flasks, and the entire barn reeked of fermentation. Wickham met the inspector at the barn entrance, explaining that he was conducting an agricultural experiment that involved volatile materials and that it would be unsafe to enter. The inspector, a methodical man in his 50s, explained that regulations required him to inspect all structures. Wickham suggested scheduling a return visit when his experiment was complete. The inspector refused. He had a schedule to maintain and other farms to visit. He would inspect the barn now, or he would file a report noting non-compliance, which would trigger a formal investigation. Wickham made a calculated decision. He invited the inspector inside, but only into the barn's outer section, explaining that the experimental area was isolated for safety. He showed the inspector his legitimate farm equipment, his properly stored hay, and his correctly maintained fire extinguishers. The inspector noted these approvingly. Then he asked about the smell. What kind of experiment produced such an odour? Wickham, drawing on 2 years of practiced deception, explained that he was attempting to produce agricultural alcohol for use as a fuel supplement, a practice that was being researched by various agricultural colleges. He had permission from the local agricultural committee to experiment with small-scale fermentation to determine if it might be viable for farm use. He was, he admitted, not very successful. The process was more difficult than anticipated, which explained the strong smell of failed fermentation. The inspector, who knew nothing about distillation but much about fire safety, asked if this experiment posed any fire hazards. Wickham assured him that he used only electric heating elements, maintained proper ventilation, and kept fire extinguishers nearby. The inspector examined the outer barn area, found no obvious violations, and departed with a warning to ensure proper safety measures. He never entered the concealed inner sections where the still operated, and 36 gallons of finished ethanol sat in storage. Wickham stood in the barn doorway, watching the inspector's vehicle disappear down the road, and felt his legs weaken. He had been seconds from exposure, from arrest, prosecution, the destruction of an operation that had supplied SOE for nearly 2 years. Only the inspector's focus on fire safety rather than agricultural regulations had saved him. It was, Wickham realized, a matter of pure luck, and luck was not a sustainable security measure. Ashford conveyed it to the mayor, who arrived personally 2 days later. They discussed the situation with unusual directness. The operation had been extraordinarily successful, producing over 8,000 gallons of various alcohols over 21 months, but every additional month increased risk exponentially. The mayor asked Wickham's assessment. Could he continue? Wickham considered the question carefully. Technically, yes, he had grain supplies, functioning equipment, and established procedures. But psychologically, the near miss had shaken him. He was 53 years old, exhausted from 2 years of nocturnal labor and constant tension. His farm's legitimate operations had declined from neglect, and most significantly, the strategic situation had changed. The Allies were advancing, slowly but inexorably. The desperate shortages that had necessitated improvised supply chains were easing. His contribution, while meaningful, was no longer irreplaceable. He told the Major he would continue through the end of the year, then cease operations. 3 more months would allow him to produce another 150 gallons, fulfilling existing commitments while beginning the careful process of dismantling the operation. The Major accepted this with understanding, expressing gratitude for service that, he noted with dry irony, could never be officially acknowledged. December of 1944 marked Wickham's final month of production. He distilled his last batch on December 28th, watching the clear liquid drip into collection flasks with mixed emotions. He had begun this work out of patriotism and necessity, expecting it to last perhaps a few months. It had consumed 2 years of his life. He had violated laws he had never broken before, risked his freedom and his farm, and lived with persistent anxiety that any day might bring exposure. Yet he had also participated, in his small way, in the defeat of Nazi tyranny. The Major collected the final delivery on January 2, 1945. He brought unexpected news. Wickham would receive a formal commendation, but one that could never be presented. A letter would be placed in sealed files, acknowledging his contribution to SOE operations. It would remain classified for decades, perhaps forever. There would be no medal, no public recognition, no acknowledgement beyond this private conversation. The mayor seemed apologetic about this, but Wickham understood. Secrecy had protected the operation. Secrecy would have to be its memorial. Wickham spent the following weeks methodically dismantling the distillery. He disassembled the still, storing components in different locations. He cleaned the fermentation vats until no trace of their use remained. He filled the concealed cellar with ordinary farm supplies, removing any evidence of its hidden purpose. He burned his production records in his fireplace, watching 2 years of careful documentation transform into ash. By February, no physical evidence remained that Wickham's barn had been anything other than a typical agricultural structure. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Wickham's son returned from the continent in July, bearing stories of the fighting and liberation. Wickham listened, knowing he possessed his own stories that he could never share. When his son asked what Wickham had done during the war, he replied simply that he had farmed and contributed what he could to the war effort. It was, in the narrowest sense, true. The full scope of SOE's operations remained classified for decades. When documents began emerging in the 1970s and 80s, historians pieced together the organization's complex supply networks. They documented the critical shortages that had threatened to cripple covert operations. They noted the improvised solutions, the creative procurement, the networks of suppliers who had operated outside official channels, but individual sources were rarely identified. The farmers, chemists, and workshops that had formed SOE's shadow supply chain remained anonymous, protected by classification. Wickham never learned the complete story of where his alcohol went. He never knew which specific operations it supported, which agents relied on equipment powered by his ethanol, which intelligence breakthroughs came from documents processed with his solvents. The operational security that had protected him during the war also ensured his permanent ignorance of his contribution's full impact. He continued farming until 1958, when age and declining health forced him to sell the farm and retire to a cottage in the village. He never spoke publicly about the distillery, maintaining the secrecy that had become habitual. When he died in 1963, at age 72, His obituary noted his decades of farming and his service during the war years in supporting agricultural production. No mention was made of the illegal distillery that had operated in his barn, producing thousands of gallons of ethanol for secret operations. The historical significance of operations like Wickham's lies not in dramatic action but in mundane necessity. Modern military histories often focus on battles, strategies, and technologies, the visible elements of warfare. But wars are won through logistics, supply chains, and the countless small contributions that enable larger operations. Every commando raid required equipment, every resistance cell needed supplies, every intelligence operation demanded specialized materials. These didn't materialize spontaneously, they flowed through complex networks of procurement, production, and distribution. Official supply channels, designed for conventional military operations, often proved inadequate for covert warfare's unique demands. Standard procurement processes moved too slowly. Normal security procedures were too visible. Conventional suppliers couldn't provide the flexibility and discretion that clandestine operations required. Organizations like SOE necessarily developed shadow supply networks, recruiting unconventional sources who operated outside official systems. These improvised networks carried significant risks. Suppliers like Wickham worked without legal protection. If discovered by civil authorities, they faced prosecution under the same laws that applied to common criminals. The organizations they supplied couldn't acknowledge them without compromising operational security. They worked in isolation, never fully understanding how their contribution fit into larger operations, sustained only by faith that their work mattered. The ethical complexity of such arrangements deserves recognition. Wickham was asked to break laws designed to prevent profiteering and ensure equitable resource distribution, legitimate goals that served important purposes. The rationing system he circumvented existed to prevent the black market exploitation that had caused suffering in previous conflicts. Yet that same system, through bureaucratic rigidity, impeded military operations that might shorten the war and save lives. Wickham navigated this moral ambiguity by producing only for military purposes, accepting payment that covered costs and labor, but avoiding the excessive profits that defined black market operations. He violated the letter of rationing law while arguably honoring its spirit. The technical achievement of Wickham's operation also merits consideration. Industrial distillation is complex chemistry, requiring precise temperature control, careful separation of fractions, and rigorous quality testing. Wickham, with minimal formal training, learned to produce ethanol meeting military specifications using improvised equipment in an uncontrolled environment. He maintained consistent output despite material shortages, fuel limitations, and the constant risk of discovery. His success required not just courage, but genuine technical competence. Perhaps most remarkably, Wickham sustained this operation for 2 years while maintaining his farm's legitimate productivity. He couldn't allow the distillery to compromise his visible farming work. Declining crop yields would attract investigation. He somehow balanced nocturnal distillation with daytime farming, managed grain supplies to support both operations, and maintained the appearance of a normally functioning farm. This required extraordinary discipline and organizational skill. The few SOE supply operations that have been documented suggest Wickham's experience was not unique. Across Britain, a network of small suppliers provided specialized materials through covert channels. A bicycle shop in London produced silent weapons. A chemist in Manchester synthesized explosives. A seamstress in Edinburgh created concealed pockets in civilian clothing. Each operated independently, most never knowing of the other's existence, forming an uncoordinated web that collectively supported thousands of operations. These suppliers shared common characteristics. Most were ordinary civilians with specialized skills. Most operated in violation of wartime regulations. Most worked for modest payment that reflected labor value rather than black market rates. Most maintained operational security so successfully that their contributions remained unknown for decades. And most, like Wickham, returned to ordinary life after the war, carrying secrets they would never share. The moral calculus of such operations remains complex. From a utilitarian perspective, breaking rationing laws to support military operations that shortened the war and reduced casualties seems clearly justified. The harm caused by Wickham's grain diversion, his neighbours received slightly less flour, his district's agricultural statistics were marginally inaccurate pales compared to the potential lives saved by the operations his ethanol enabled. Yet this reasoning, taken too far, justifies any means for sufficiently important ends. Where does necessary flexibility end and harmful lawlessness begin? Wickham's own perspective, expressed in the few oblique comments he made to family in later years, suggested he viewed his actions as a temporary necessity rather than a permanent principle. He broke laws because those laws, designed for peacetime stability, inadequately accommodated wartime urgency. He accepted personal risk because the alternative, allowing bureaucratic processes to impede critical operations, seemed more dangerous. But he resumed law-abiding life immediately after the war ended, suggesting he viewed his illegal activities as exceptional responses to exceptional circumstances rather than generally acceptable behavior. The broader historical lesson concerns the gap between official systems and operational realities. Military organizations, like all large bureaucracies, depend on established procedures and formal processes. These systems work well for routine operations, but often prove inadequate for unusual demands. When official channels fail, two options exist: accept the limitation or develop unofficial alternatives. World War II repeatedly demonstrated that rigid adherence to official procedures could cost lives. The organizations that adapted most successfully were those willing to work outside formal systems when circumstances demanded. SOE's use of suppliers like Wickham reflected this pragmatic flexibility. The organization couldn't wait weeks for official procurement processes to deliver critical materials. It couldn't rely on conventional suppliers whose paperwork and procedures would compromise operational security. It needed speed, discretion, and reliability qualities, more easily found in individual craftsmen working outside official systems than in formal supply chains. The ethical cost recruiting civilians to break laws was balanced against the operational benefit of faster, more flexible supply networks. The fact that such operations remained secret for decades reveals both their success and their problematic nature. Success, because effective security prevented German intelligence from identifying and targeting these supply networks. Problematic, because the secrecy also prevented public accountability and historical recognition. Wickham and others like him took significant risks for their country but received no acknowledgement. This seems unjust, yet acknowledging them would have compromised the very secrecy that made their contribution possible. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.